Discourse on Voluntary Servitude by Etienne de la Boetie. A short political treatise which, despite being written hundreds of years ago, can be said to be still quite relevant to today's world. In fact, could argue that this is truly something of a timeless work. So, Etienne de la Boetie, maybe I'm pronouncing that correctly, if you don't know, was a French magistrate of some sort who was a contemporary of and a friend of, I believe, the famed essayist Michel de Montaigne. But Boetie himself was also something of an essayist and is best remembered today for having penned this, the Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, a very brief little monograph concerning such topics as power and submission. So, in the Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, Boetie questions why tyranny exists when the subjects of said tyranny can always cast off their yoke simply by no longer complying. That is, tyranny and slavery, to an extent, are always voluntary to a degree, hence the title of the work, Discourse on Voluntary Servitude. And people can, again, cast off their yoke at any time by simply not going along with their subjection anymore. Furthermore, Boetie goes on to muse that continued subjection and slavery over time inculcates in the populace the inability to successfully revolt because they lack the aptitude to imagine themselves as anything but enslaved. And I think that truly is pretty valid observation, because we've seen that throughout history, that people who have been kept in servitude for generations often have trouble breaking the cycle, so to speak. And Boetie goes on to reflect on whether people actually want freedom at heart, and he comes to the conclusion that most people don't genuinely want freedom, and that they will be all too eager to throw it away for bread and circuses, that they will choose, the majority of people, material comfort over individual liberty. And again, I think that is an extremely valid observation. And then beyond that, Boetie goes on to speculate on the nature of tyranny and how it comes to be. And he postulates that tyranny occurs because people will latch on to figures of authority, people in power, in order to further their own aims and make themselves better off, even again if they have to forfeit the exercise of their own wills. That tyranny ultimately becomes this kind of pyramidal top-down type thing, where you have a ruler or a few select ruling individuals on top, and then subordinates under them, and then subordinates under those subordinates, each of whom is using the system to further their own material ends, even if, again, they have to forfeit a certain degree of their own liberty. And that eventually you get down to like the common man, who is just totally enserfed by the system itself. And that's kind of the way tyranny, despotism operates. So that is the contents of the Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, as best as I can give it. Again, this is a very brief work. You can read the whole thing in probably right around an hour. It is very short. But as I said, I think that its observations and its musings, its insights are nevertheless still valuable and probably always will be. And more than that, it can be argued that they were ahead of the curve in certain ways. As Boetie opens the work by questioning why tyranny even exists when everybody can just, walk away at any time and cease to support their own bondage. We see that sentiment kind of manifested in practice with later figures such as like Gandhi, right? Who proved that, yeah, you can just walk away at any time. That's not to say that there won't be consequences. And I think the reason why most people remain in bondage, and history has shown, especially the history of the 20th century, has shown that large populations of people will endure extremely harsh conditions, extreme penury, and extreme oppression to avoid open confrontation or punition from their rulers. But as I said, figures such as Gandhi do demonstrate that ultimately servitude, enslavement is to an extent a voluntary position, and that the slaves, the serfs, can just stop being slaves and serfs by simply refusing to comply. Although again, consequences likely will ensue. But beyond just that, Boetie prefigures certain later writings of the philosopher David Hume by recognizing that despotism, tyranny, always, to an extent at least, has to rest upon consent. That's not to say that it has to rest upon the consent of everybody, because again, at the base of the pyramid, there's always a large population of like common people who are not in the best of positions societally, but above them there are people that perpetuate this system of oppression through their own active participation, because they contribute to the system. They contribute to their own higher ups because they're trying to further their own material ends and gain more for themselves. And again, that's something that Hume later wrote on in his essays. He as well recognized that to an extent, despotism always has to rest upon the consent of at least a certain number of people. One person, after all, can never rule alone, right? But beyond just that, in the work, Boetie reflects on the nature of political authority, and he distinguishes three principal types of rulers. That is, the elected officials, the conquering warlords, and the hereditary monarchs. And he says that of those three, the elected officials are probably the best because their power, at least nominally, comes from the people, right, through election. But he is also skeptical even of that type of power and political authority, because he avers that even elected officials will inevitably tend over time to try to consolidate power in certain ways, and that it will eventually degenerate into more explicitly despotic types of authority. And in that musing, he seems to prefigure Lord Acton's later dictum that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This book was pretty radical for the time it was written. In fact, I think it was so radical that it was not even published until posthumously, because it's not just skeptical of like nakedly murderous tyrants and, emperors like Caesar or Nero. It's questioning the legitimacy of any type of political authority and why people will allow themselves to be bought with what is at base their own property, right? That they will allow things to be taken from them and then doled back out to them to buy their favor. It's a pretty penetrating look at, again, not just more openly authoritarian types of political authority, but just kind of political authority in general. And it has some pretty keen insights into the farcical nature of the whole business. And again, it was pretty radical for the time, and it has historically been an inspiration to radical thinkers across the political spectrum, from anarchists to libertarians and etc. It's quite an influential little work, and it packs a lot into a little, I would say. So, as per usual, I don't rate nonfiction philosophical work such as this, but I will say I found this little work to be quite intriguing and very insightful in some ways, and I'm very glad that I read it. So, the Discourse on Voluntary Servitude by Etienne de la Boetie. Maybe, again, I'm pronouncing that correctly. Have you read this work? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with what I've said about it here today. And if you haven't read this little book, I would recommend picking it up. I think, once again, it's very insightful, and it kind of has a timeless quality because Boetie was really looking at things kind of in advance of the time in which he was writing, I think, because once more, this was not even published until after he was dead, because I think its sentiments were too radical for the time. But it has only proved its relevance throughout history, I would say, and how spot on some of its observations and musings are. So yeah, I could definitely recommend it. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.